I'm David Crow, and this is episode 258 of The Infectious Myth. Email me at david.crow@theinfectiousmyth.com. That's Crow with an E. Like our page and respond to postings at facebook.com/theinfectiousmyth, and join our discussion group at facebook.com/groups/theinfectiousmyth. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at infectiousmyth. You can listen every Tuesday at 2 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time on prn.fm, or subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or other programs. You can listen to any of the last 5 episodes over the phone by dialing the U.S. number 701-719-0990 and following the instructions. PRN.FM has voicemail. Call 862-800-6805 and leave a message, your name, and indicate that it is for The Infectious Myth. If you dial either of these numbers, long-distance charges may apply. I don't know that you're a listener until I hear from you, so send me a message letting me know how you stay in touch with the show and what you like about it. If you include your mailing address, I'll send you a little thank you gift, one of the bookmarks I make by hand using my own photographs. I do really love to hear from my listeners, so don't be shy. And a special thanks to all the new Patreon donors who signed up this month. You can make a one-time donation to the expenses of the show via PayPal using the email david.crow@theinfectiousmyth.com, or commit to monthly donations at patreon.com or liberapay.com, where we are also Infectious Myth, one word. We appreciate all our listeners, but if you want this show to continue to grow and improve, consider paying a small amount for the information that you are gleaning, for the support you get for some non-mainstream ideas, and the challenges to others. I appreciate you commenting and suggesting guests. I appreciate your financial support as well. Thanks for listening and for recommending this show to your friends. Pharmaceutical companies want to make a lot of money off COVID-19 without too many moral qualms over the safety of drugs or vaccines. We've seen that with vaccine trials and with the drug remdesivir. However, pharmaceutical company ethical lapses on a grand scale are not unique to the coronavirus. And today we're going to talk to Jim Gottstein, who has been very involved in obtaining information about Zyprexa and trying to prevent people in Alaska from being forcibly drugged with Zyprexa and other drugs. He has a new book called the Zyprexa Papers. Jim Gottstein grew up in Anchorage, Alaska. Instead of going into the family grocery and real estate business, he opted for a business degree at the University of Oregon. But once he took a business law class, he was hooked on the law and managed to get into Harvard Law School as the only skydiving applicant from Alaska that year. After graduating in 1978, Jim went into private practice in Anchorage, primarily representing Alaska Native organizations. In 1982, he experienced a psychotic break due to sleep deprivation and was introduced firsthand to the mental illness system. He was told he would be permanently mentally ill and to forget about his law career. Luckily, he escaped psychiatry, and the experience led him to legal representation and other advocacy for people diagnosed with serious mental illness who are not as lucky as him. He opened his own law office in 1985, generally focused on business matters, and is now mostly retired from the private practice of law. In 2002, Jim founded the Law Project for Psychiatric Rights, short form Psych Rights, to mount a strategic litigation campaign against forced psychiatric drugging and electroshock, and to inform the public about the counterproductive and harmful nature of the drugs and shock. He's the author of the Zyprexa Papers, which is the reason for this interview. Welcome to the show, Jim.
Thanks for having me.
Would you like to talk about your psychotic break, or maybe not like, but would you talk about it? Like what happened, what you think the causes were, what your symptoms were, and how you got out of it without becoming a permanent customer of the psychiatrists and drug companies?
Sure, I think it's important to talk about it to kind of bust the myth that it's some kind of brain defect and it's a lifelong quote disease and people can't get better. So so I had I just I had never really experienced a situation where I, couldn't do everything, quote, that needed to be done. Um, uh, and I had just gotten back from Europe. I was opening my law practice and I was running for the state Senate, um, all at the same time.
Right?
When I got back, I was jet lagged and I was really behind on the Senate campaign, which I had a
Mm-hmm.
pretty good chance of winning, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And and one of the things, what happens to me, which I've, found out is um, if I have so much stuff going on that, that I'm trying to work out in my mind, what should I do? What's the strategy? All that kind of stuff. I can't stop thinking about it and and sleep.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was and so that happened to me. And I had uh, n- never experienced the situation where, my thinking would be unreliable. So that was just not something that would, be in my conception until that point. So anyway, I was uh, not sleeping, and I had gone over to my dad's house and to try and sleep, and I'd laid down in his bed there on the second floor, uh, and I had just fallen asleep. When I woke up and thought I heard the devil coming down the hall.
Mm.
So, so So I went to the window, it's the second floor again, and I looked down, and there was a lawn, and then there was this sidewalk down there. And I thought to myself, if I can miss the sidewalk, I know how to do a PLF, stands for parachute landing fall, and I won't hurt myself. And I was in my underwear. It's about 1 a.m. in the morning in June, which means that it's light. Um, so I jumped out of the window, which is perfectly logical if the devil is coming down the hall, right?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense if that's what you're believing in the moment. Yeah.
So I and executed a perfect parachute landing fall in my underwear, and ran across the street to this parking lot, and I kept looking over my shoulder for the devil. So
Yeah.
I was spinning around, looking over my shoulder. Anyway, they hauled me off. They put me in a straitjacket and hauled me off to the hospital, um,
Mm-hmm.
where and then injected me with something to put me to sleep. So uh, then I wake up in this, hospital bed, and there's this male nurse or clerk or something at the end of the bed on a chair with a clipboard on his knee, and he asks me, "What day is it?" And I say, "How long have I been asleep?" So he writes down, doesn't know, what day it is. I mean, there's this thing: are you oriented to, to name, date, and place?
Right. Right. Mm-hmm.
That's one of the things. So they put down that I wasn't oriented as to time. But again, that was a perfectly logical question because I didn't know how long I'd been asleep. So,
Perfectly logical answer.
or answer,
Right. I mean, it
exactly.
seems like you should know what day it is, but if you've been put on a drug to put you to sleep, I mean, who knows how long you slept? It's true.
Right. Right. So, I mean, I could go into more what happened there. Like one of the things is, and they basically said, if you don't sign yourself in, we're going to go to court and get you committed. And
Mm-hmm.
as bad off as I was, I knew I didn't want that on my record. And so um, I signed myself in, but I was basically locked up there. And it's kind of an Alice in Wonderland experience in a psych hospital. And
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so one of the things I did was I would kind of go limp and make them catch me as a form of protest. And one time they didn't catch me and I hit my head and I go, oh, maybe I should quit doing that. And I used to make a joke that about ties, that it's ridiculous to tie a rope around your neck every morning. So they wrote down, he thinks a tie is for hanging yourself.
Suicidal ideation.
Yeah, but I had said that, that was a common joke that I'd said for years. And the message basically was that I would, never get better, that,
Which
I'd
is
have to
which is
be,
a strange message, because they're giving you drugs that they claim are going to help you, but they're also claiming that they're not going to help you that much that you're going to get healthy again.
right. Well, that's right. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but basically psychiatry, the way it's practiced today, doesn't make much sense. So, I mean, basically the drugs are to um, sedate you enough so that you're not causing trouble. And so one of the things that happened was, they those that believed I was a lawyer said I would never practice law again.
Right.
And when I told them that I'd gone to Harvard Law School, that confirmed that I was delusional.
Even though it was true.
Right. And if if you read if people read the book, the Zyprexa papers, the person for whom I subpoenaed them, Bill Bigley, at one point, the reporter for the New York Times came up to cover a trial of Alaska v. Lilly, the state of Alaska versus Lilly, the manufacturer of Zyprexa papers, of Zyprexa.
Right.
And so the Alaska v. Lilly was going on up, in one courtroom, and this commitment hearing for Bill Bigley was going on down below. And so he wrote a story about that and Bill Bigley and, in the trial. And so at more than one of these commitment hearings, the psychiatrist said that Bill claiming that he was in the New York Times just, prove that he was
delusional.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of crazy. I mean, they have no information. It's unlikely that he'd be in the New York Times, but he was. I mean, unlikely things happen, right? Maybe it was unlikely. Maybe it was unlikely that you went to Harvard Law School. Not too many people do, but it's possible. So unless it's not true, that's not, that doesn't make much sense. I mean, it doesn't say that they have a very high standard for the information they're going to use to keep you there. So did you develop a strategy to get out? Did you just calmly wait until your time of commitment was over and then get the heck out of there? Or how did you get out?
I was there for 30 days. And, now that I think about it, I wonder if that was because that's when the insurance ran out. But although I had a pretty big bill that I ended up paying, and so, but yeah, I was there for 30 days. And I went, my family has some resources and stuff, and and my dad found this, had this industrial psychiatrist or psychologist, and he recommended this guy in New Rochelle, New York, which actually people know about now because of the pandemic. But at the time, it was more famous for being where Laura and Rob Petrie lived from the Dick Van Dyke Show. Anyway, the psychiatrist was nice enough. He didn't help me a bit. He ended up diagnosing me with bipolar disorder, which is also known as manic depression. Mm-hmm. And then but I ended up. I've been so lucky And so one of the things that happened, this was actually before I went to New Show, is they wanted to put me on lithium. And I was a pilot, and I wouldn't lose my license or my medical certificate, technically, if I was on lithium, but they didn't care. And
No.
so, and it was really important to me, flying. Flying in Alaska is just fabulous. And, but my creatinine clearance test didn't come out right. So my kidney function, they were a little concerned about. And lithium is very toxic on kidneys. I recently lost a friend who died from that. And so they sent me to a nephrologist, a kidney doctor, to do a kidney biopsy. And he was poking this big needle in my back, and he couldn't find my kidney. So I ended up not getting put on lithium, which was really lucky.
Yes.
But the luckiest thing that happened is my mother, who was actually the executive director of the Alaska Mental Health Association, referred me to this Dr. Robert Alberts, who's this fantastic guy. He's a psychiatrist. He was Dutch, and he was a prisoner of war during World War II of the Japanese in Indonesia. Anyway, he was just a fabulous guy, and I would talk to him, and he said he wanted to get a partner or something, but he said it was so hard to find anybody with any common sense. But he basically told me that anybody that doesn't get sleep will become psychotic. And I could, just learn how to deal with it, which is, what I've done. And so it's not really rocket science to figure out when I'm getting in trouble. If I don't sleep, and I don't have a great tolerance for that, that's gonna
yeah. With me, I had problems with dehydration from flying, flying to Asia and places like that, and I wouldn't, drink enough water, and I had a couple of out-of-body experiences, but luckily it never got to the point where I ended up in a psychiatric hospital. But when I realized what was going on, all I needed to do was to drink water if I started to feel dizzy and start to feel, a little bit like the world wasn't real. And like with you, I guess it's just sleep. And once you know that you're maybe more sensitive to this issue than other people, it's pretty easy to manage it. But if you're unaware of it, you don't, when I first had these situations, I just accidentally drank tea because I couldn't think of anything else to do at 2:00 in the morning in my hotel room. That's all I had. And all of a sudden I'm getting better, but I didn't clue in that was the issue. And, what if I'd done something crazy and got dragged off to psychiatric hospital? I might be still on psychiatric drugs.
There are so many people that get captured and never escape. I mean, it's millions of people.
Right. We'll talk about Bill Bigley later, because his history was pretty shocking. But I want to talk to you, make sure we talk about Zyprexa. Before we get into the importance of the Zyprexa paper, can you talk about what kind of a drug it is, what it's approved for? Is it effective? Is it safe? Is it still widely used? Some background on Zyprexa.
So Zyprexa is one of the what they call the second generation of neuroleptics. And I use the term neuroleptic instead of the marketing term antipsychotic, because they don't really have an antipsychotic property for most people. But what they do is they block, the older ones, like Thorazine and Haldol and Stelazine and Prolixin and Mellaril, which is the one they gave me, block 70 to 90% the dopamine transmission in the frontal lobes, the basal ganglia, and the limbic system. And the newer ones, the second generation, do that, plus they do a lot of other stuff. So they're actually worse. So Zyprexa, so so they block 70 to 90% of the dopamine transmission in the frontal lobe. So they're literally a chemical lobotomy. And so what that does is that just, suppresses the brain activity so much that people just are not able to cause the trouble
right, which appears right, which appears like it's an improvement, right? Because the person's not shouting and yelling and throwing things, so we've got success.
Right, and but the problem is, one of the problems is that so the brain compensates for this blockage of dopamine. And the first thing that it does for a few weeks is it grows more dopamine receptors. So while they've never found any kind of brain abnormality in people who are diagnosed, say, with schizophrenia, before the drugs, after the drugs are, introduced, they do see different brain changes, these extra dopamine receptors, and actually brain shrinkage, and there's cognitive decline and all that kind of stuff. So one of the things that happens is after you've been on it for a while and you have these extra dopamine receptors, if you especially abruptly withdraw from the drug, then you'll have this flood of dopamine, and that causes a bunch of psychiatric symptoms for a lot of people. But it's not really from any underlying, quote, mental illness. It's from,
so you're saying if you stop the drug that this comes back?
Well, it's really not coming back. It's a drug caused symptom. But then they'll say, oh, see, you need the drug.
Right. So withdrawal from the drug causes symptoms which are interpreted as we're unmasking the underlying condition. How long does it take somebody to wean themselves off Zyprexa? And can you do it cold turkey, or do you need to, take it slowly because of the addictive effects?
There's a wide variation of people in terms of how people's success. So it's basically not recommended that you abruptly withdraw or cold turkey. So the kind of rule of thumb is you should take as long to get off as you were on it, up to a year.
Right.
There's a couple of great withdrawal books. One is the free harm reduction guide to coming off psychiatric drugs. That's a free download on the internet, and there's a link to it on the PsychRights website on the page psychrights.org, psychrights.org.
Okay,
and then there's a book by Dr. Peter Breggin.
Yes.
Yeah, coming off psychiatric drug withdrawal, I think it's called. And one of the really interesting things about both books is they spend a lot of time discussing the importance of being in a setting where you can go through what you need to go through to get off, so have a supportive environment. I think one of the really good things is to have someone that you'll trust, hopefully, even if you're, start to develop symptoms, to tell you when, things are maybe getting up, you're getting into trouble. And so I think the thing to basically do is you go down slowly, and then if you start to have, symptoms that are too problematic, that you go up to where back up to where you were. And then, and then start back down slowly again. And a lot of people are on multiple drugs, And Dr. Bregan suggests that you withdraw from one at a time because otherwise you can't really tell what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And my sense of things is, almost everybody can substantially reduce the amount that they're taking, but some people, and it's not a small, real small percentage, just, they get to that last small dose and they just can't get off it. And,
Mm-hmm.
my theory is, well, it's not just a theory, it's way better to be on less than more. And so
Right.
if you get down, excuse me, if you can get, down to just a little bit, that's good. Now, one of the ones, the class of drugs that are extremely difficult to get off of are what's called the benzodiazepines.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Valium, Xanax, Klonopin, um, that I forget some of the other ones. So, and they're given for sleep. And one of the, well, I don't know, you want to hear, I'll talk a little bit more about my strategy.
Huh.
So I, if I'm not getting sleep, I know what to look for. So the first thing that'll happen is that I get kind of sharp and witty, and
Mm-hmm.
nobody notices except me, that I can tell.
Right.
And then I'll have, what's called thought blocking, which is where you're talking and you just kind of stop in the middle. It's
Mm-hmm.
not quite like not finding words. And so, that's kind of the next progression. And then I'll get to the point where I think people are looking at me funny.
Right. A little bit of
Yeah,
paranoia.
paranoia. Yeah. And so then what I do is I, think to myself, okay, people probably aren't looking at me funny.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I just, and I say, I really say that. But then the other thing I do, and it's interesting you say out of body experience, I kind of, um, well, then I think, but if they are looking at me funny, it's probably because I'm doing something weird. And so then what I try and do is observe, what I'm doing so that I
Mm-hmm.
don't do anything. So I kind of like observe myself from up above to make sure that I'm not doing anything weird. And when I get to that point, it's not, it's not a good sign. And so I will take a benzo for one night,
Mm-hmm.
just to stop that cycle.
Right.
And
Because if you're trying to go to sleep and your brain is racing and you can't go to sleep, it's kind of worse than
right,
being
so
up.
I just do that, and I like this one called Halcyon, which is much maligned because people committed murder on it, much higher doses than me, which is
Mm-hmm.
what Dr. Alberts told me. And so uh, that's one of the ways that I deal with it. But the other way that I deal with it is to try not to put myself in a position where I'm not sleeping. And as a lawyer, you have deadlines for filings and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so most lawyers, you can always make it better. You can go through it again and make it better. So most lawyers will file right at the deadline. And what I do is I try and file the day before.
Right.
I get it, I get it to where I think it's good enough. And I like to think, my good enough is pretty good. And I'll file it the day before if I can.
Right. And then you don't have that stress of I'm going to have to stay up till, the last minute to get this done.
Right. And right. So those are my basic strategies. And there's this program, Mary Ellen, what's it called? It's funny, I'm spacing it out. All right, I might think about it later. There's this a program about how to figure out what your, triggers are, what helps, and having a wellness recovery action plan, the RAP program,
Mm.
where you figure out what your triggers are, what helps, and then if you run into trouble, to have a, kind of an emergency plan.
Okay.
And that's very good.
Well, let's talk a little bit about, the specific Zyprexa papers, which it's sort of reminiscent of the Pentagon papers. And there were a number of things about the adventures that went on that kind of reminded me of what happened with the Pentagon papers. But presumably you were sensitized to the fact that Zyprexa was a bad drug and it was being over promoted by Eli Lilly, the manufacturer, which allowed them to make buckets more money than if they'd had maybe a more ethical marketing campaign. I mean, one of the things you described was off-label promotion of off-label uses, and that is illegal, right? For a drug company to say maybe you should use it on young people when it's not approved for young people or something like that.
Correct. In the U.S., drugs are approved for specific uses, but the doctors can prescribe them for anything.
Mm.
But the drug companies are not allowed to promote it for anything except the approved uses.
Right. So you received from a lawyer, I think you said, millions of pages of documents, maybe on a CD or DVD
what
or something.
happened? So, there's this expert witness, Dr. David Eagleman, who's a physician of conscience.
All right, not a lawyer, but an expert witness. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and he was an expert witness in this giant, it's multi-district litigation where literally 25,000 separate cases against Eli Lilly for causing diabetes and other metabolic problems that were consolidated into one case for discovery and settlement purposes. And discovery is where the parties are required to provide the other parties, with documents or, answer questions and those kind of things. And so and that's one of the reasons for getting all these cases together, is they had one central depository, one central place for all of these documents. And Eli Lilly put in I don't know, it was millions of pages. And in order to facilitate that, the plaintiff's lawyers, the people, the lawyers representing the people that were alleged they were harmed by it, and Lilly entered into an agreement. It's called a protective order, or I call it a secrecy order or agreement, that was then ordered by the court, which one of the things it provided was that if someone was like Eagleman was subpoenaed in another case, he had to give Lilly notice and a reasonable opportunity to object before, providing the documents. So that, and Eagleman wanted to do that, find someone to do that so he could get the New York Times to write an expose about the whole thing.
Right. So he wanted you to subpoena him?
Right. And the reason why he got me was I had a case involving Zyprexa a couple of years before. Mm-hmm. And I had this really great expert, Dr. Grace Jackson, and she looked at the documents, the studies that were used to approve Zyprexa, and she, found where they had, basically fraudulent. And so she wrote a report called Olanzapine, which is a chemical name for Zyprexa. Mm-hmm. Olanzapine, dangerous drug, dubious efficacy, or something like that. And actually it was Alex Berenson, the reporter for the New York Times, who found that report on the internet because I post all these documents.
Right.
And so Berenson suggested to Dr. Eagleman that he give me a call. And I, of course, was very interested in the documents. And it was interesting for me, the idea that Zyprexa caused diabetes was not news, and I've
Right.
even posted on the internet about it. But, I knew that having the New York Times, write what ended up being a series of front page stories on it,
Right.
would have a much bigger effect.
One of the interesting aspects was that you did subpoena Eagleman. You got these millions of pages.
Well, I only got what he did is he took from the millions of pages, I don't know, it's probably, I don't know, 1,000, 1,500 pages, maybe not even, of the key ones that, that showed where they knew that it caused Zyprexa, caused diabetes and
right, which is good
because we got to come clean with this, and of course they didn't.
Right. It seems like companies can take two strategies if they don't want you to see information. One is to fight to give you as little as possible, and the other one is to give you far more than is necessary, including a lot of completely irrelevant stuff, and hope that you can never find the gems. But so anyway, Eagleman had sort of sifted through this for you, so you had a relatively small amount of stuff. But one of the problems that came out in the case, because this ended up in lengthy litigation, was that you didn't know whether your current client was going to be had been forced or would be forced to use Zyprexa. Turns out you were right, but you couldn't prove it. And
one of the things, what happened was, I was pretty sure he'd been given it.
Mm-hmm.
But when I talked to him, he had other things on his mind. But I asked him, I asked the hospital to give him an authorization for release of information to sign, where they would give me his records. And this was before I subpoenaed. And they refused to even let him sign it, saying he had a guardian and only the guardian could sign. So that's why I didn't have the records. And it turns out he had been drugged with Zyprexa against his will within a week of when I subpoenaed him.
Wow.
And he was drugged with Zyprexa against his will.
And the hospital was participating in the cover-up. And was this Bill Bigley?
Yes.
In your book, you described Bill Bigley as having been hospitalized over 80 times. Sort of right. Like, by hospitalized, I mean grabbed off the street, put into the hospital, and forcibly medicated, not just hospitalized.
Right. I mean, he ended up with pretty close to 100 by the time he died.
Mm-hmm. And you had many cases with him, which had varying outcomes. But like in the case where you were forcibly injected, like what was the theoretical legal standard and what was the actual legal standard where they can stick a needle in you?
Well, I guess when I was first brought into the hospital, I mean, the only time they considered it voluntary. So never got court orders against me. And the only time, they stuck a needle in me was when I got hauled into the hospital the first time. I don't even remember. I kind of have this vague recollection of being in the admitting, part there. But so that was the only time they injected me. Otherwise, I took it. I didn't really like it, but it really didn't really affect me that much. The way I was, from my perception. But I kind of lost the thread of your question here.
Well, my question, maybe this is more appropriate with Bigley, is like a lot of the fights you had over forced medication were trying to follow the legal standard, where the
Oh,
hospital
oh
seemed to
yeah,
be
yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
sidestepping the standard for forced medication.
So the statute in Alaska says that if the person is incompetent to decide whether to either take it or decline it, that the hospital gets to do whatever it wants. You can go to court and say if the court finds the person incompetent, the hospital gets to do whatever you want.
Mm-hmm.
And so actually that case that Berenson fined about Olanzapine, Zyprexa, with the Jackson report, I had just won an Alaska Supreme Court decision on that, where they said, which is what I argued, is they don't get to just do whatever they want just because you're incompetent. They have to at least show that it's in the person's best interest, and there's no less intrusive alternative. And so that's basically the constitutional standard in the United States, but it's ignored. I mean, I actually wrote a law review article that's on the Psych Rights homepage too, called Involuntary Commitment and Forced Drugging in the Trial Courts, Rights Violations as a Matter of Course. And so,
Yeah, I mean, it seemed like in court there was a process. They went through a few motions, they got what they wanted, and they went off, and you were disrupting that by insisting that the actual law be followed.
right, the typical process was they would, at that time, they had hearings every Tuesday and Thursday, or was it Friday? And there might be 10 or 15 cases. They started at 1:30 and they were done by 4:30. The lawyers and the judge all got to go home for dinner, and the people were locked up. And so, lots of times the petitions for the commitment and forced drugging was filed that morning.
Mm-hmm.
And there was one public defender to handle all those cases, maybe had 5 minutes to talk to the client. And the hearings were maybe 15 minutes before there was an order for the person to be locked up and drugged against their will.
And you described how the public defenders basically participated in the forced drugging, by allowing it to happen.
Yeah, in Bigley's case, they did a couple of, a couple of terrible things. But their basic attitude is, if my client wasn't crazy, she'd know this is good for her. And therefore, we're really not going to fight for their rights. But that just makes a farce of the legal system, because the state should have to prove that it's in the person's best interest and there's no less intrusive.
You also described with Bill Bigley that, he was, I think it's important that he was not sometimes a very easy person. He would do weird things and shout and things that people could see where this person's not right. But you would try to get him some support, of people that can try to calm him down and do things other than take him to the hospital and inject him with drugs. But that seemed to not be a priority and not be very easy to accomplish.
Well, the really funny thing is I proposed this system, and the hospital was just adamantly against it. But then they ended up pretty much doing it. And it worked. It worked when we had a little money that we could put to it for a little while, and it worked then. And then he was causing so much trouble. It was mainly yelling. He would yell at people. He was angry with what happened. And then he would say things like, I'm the president, or I know George Bush, or, I have, millions of dollars, and I have, an airplane, a jet, and all this stuff that, was clearly, not accurate,
the kind of thing that if you say that kind of stuff, then people go, this guy's crazy.
Yeah, and he was crazy. And but so what? I mean, does that mean you should force him to take a
Hmm.
drug that is, going to make things worse? Is going to reduce his lifespan, and not really help him? And with Bill in particular, it didn't. I never really noticed much difference with what he was so used to being drugged, and and then he would, and then go cold turkey. I mean, he'd immediately quit most of the time once they let him out. And so he was on and off, and and he was pretty much the same on or off as far as I could tell. And and it didn't work for by the time I got there. I think it was on the 67th admission, and it was like what's the definition of insanity that Einstein said, which is to do the same thing and expect a different result. And here
Right.
they were, it just wasn't working for
And
and so they wanted to do the same thing.
and do we know that part of his behavior was due to the drugs? Years of taking psychoactive substances. I mean, did that sort of exacerbate his
There's no
mental
doubt.
runs?
There's no doubt in my mind that that's true. So he was. I mean, one of the things is I really related to him. He was just 2 months older than me, and he was taken to the hospital, the same hospital I was taken to, the Alaska Psychiatric Institute, known as API, 2 years before. Um, but what brought him there was that he had a good job. He was a heavy equipment operator in Ketchikan, Alaska, for a timber company, a timber mill, and and he had a wife and 2 kids. And then his wife left him and took the daughters, and he got saddled with child support and alimony that he couldn't handle, and he had a nervous breakdown. And that's what he said when he went, when he ended up in the hospital, that he had a nervous breakdown. And so um, and his psychiatrist then was actually Robert Alberts, the one who saved my life basically. And the discharge summary, talking about his prognosis, which means his prospects for the future, that it was guarded depending on how much help he was given with dealing with his divorce. Well, he wasn't given any help with his divorce.
Right, right.
So, and he took the drugs voluntarily then, but they at that time, and this was another place where I was really lucky, is um, I mentioned that the drugs block 70 to 90% of the dopamine in the basal ganglia. Well,
Mm.
that's a kind of the movement center in your brain, or at least part of it. And so basically, that when people get Parkinson's disease, it's when they have that much
Hmm.
uh, diminution of the dopamine transmission in the basal ganglia. And so they would decide it was a therapeutic dose when they start to see what they call extrapyramidal symptoms, which basically means involuntary movements,
Hmm.
which is basically brain damage, enough brain damage so that you can't control your movements. So they basically fried his brain right at the beginning.
Right.
And so there's no doubt in my mind that what could have been a transitory problem, I mean, people, go through problems, that a transitory problem that he could have gotten through, that he was turned into, a lifelong mental patient.
Right. Well, we're getting towards the end of our time. Um, if people want to know more about this story, both the story of how you got the papers and like the long, convoluted court proceedings that occurred as Eli Lilly tried to wrest them out of your hands, and then they sort of intertwined a story of Bill Bigley, they can read your book, the Zyprexa Papers. To close off, I'd just like to ask, when it comes to Zyprexa, has anything changed? Is it still used as much as it was? Is it still making money for Eli Lilly, or are people avoiding the drug now?
I think it's used less than it would have otherwise been, but it's generic now. It's gone generic. And so
Mm-hmm. Off patent.
the big bucks, right, off patent. And so the big bucks for Lilly, have ended. It's still used, and it's still forced on people. And so one of the ironies and sadly, I gave Eli Lilly this point in our, settlement negotiations that ended up not going anywhere. But so the Alaska v. Eli Lilly was where Alaska sued Eli Lilly for the costs of treating diabetes caused by Zyprexa.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're suing Lilly for these costs caused by Zyprexa. At the same time, they're going to court and forcing people to take it.
Well, a government with cognitive dissonance, I guess that's not unusual. There's lots of examples of that, unfortunately. That is quite bizarre. I mean, I don't think that, there's been a lot of resistance to psychiatric drugging, and a lot of people looking at alternatives, like giving people, who are dealing with issues more support, so maybe they can actually get over their problems and go back to society. You mentioned a man named Robert Whitaker quite a bit. I think I might have interviewed him back towards the beginning of my podcast, but I certainly admired his work, as a journalist, uncovering the dangers of the drugs and how they're not effective, and in the end don't cure anybody. The wonders of psychiatric medication that keep people as patients for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, in fact, his book, Anatomy of an Epidemic, is what galvanized me to start Psych Rights. Because in addition to being a great read, to me, it was a litigation roadmap for challenging forced drugging, not just based on people's rights, but that it wasn't, it's not in people's best interests. So Anatomy of an Epidemic is a great book, and there's a link to it on our website. But he later wrote a book called, Mad in America, and later wrote a book called Anatomy of an Epidemic.
Right, I think I might have read both of them. They are extremely good books, and being written by a journalist, they're so well written and so easy to to read while being technical enough that you know what's going on.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jim, for joining me today. I've really appreciated this. There's so many problems with medicine, but psychiatric drugs are definitely a big one, and we're not out of the woods yet. They're still seen by a large percentage of the population as important, and the people who get off their drugs, stop their meds, are the problem. Nobody can understand why somebody would want to stop these medications.
Right. Well, it's my pleasure.
Thank you so much, Jim, and have a good day.
You too.
I have to confess that I was scammed. In my major coronavirus paper, I referenced 2 articles based on data from a company named Surgisphere. They claimed to have data feeds from hundreds of hospitals around the world, but when a journalist phoned some of them, none knew anything about this company. It seems like the data may be wholly imaginary. In one case, some authors of one of the papers requested a retraction, saying that they were never given access to the data in the first place. But wait a minute, why did you sign on? There's an excellent article by Celia Farber in uncoverdc.com that describes this incredible story. I have, of course, removed the articles from my paper and uploaded a new version, but it's a reminder to be alert. Luckily, the papers were not critical to my arguments. COVID-19 is already replete with less than ethical behavior, people scrambling for money. For example, Gilead changed how they measured the success of a remdesivir trial, essentially removing death as an outcome. Executives of Moderna, that claimed to have a wonderful technology for COVID-19 vaccine, sold 89 million in stock this year, but if the vaccine was truly great, their stock would be worth much more later. Why sell now? According to Moderna, the vaccine is producing positive data, but some scientists interviewed noted that nothing has been published, and 3 volunteers in the very small trial have experienced serious adverse events, including Ian Hayden of Seattle, who has gone on television and yet bizarrely still supports the vaccine. and was reluctant to talk about the side effects to avoid damaging the vaccine's chances. I'd like to thank new Patreon sponsors Charlotte Kickel, Dean Johnson, Eric Coppolino, John Markert, Maria Mullen, Mike Elwood, and Milena for new pledges, and one anonymous donor for a generous increase. Thanks to special friends John Jasper, Lynn Wright, and Robert Meekins. Some feedback. George, via email, I was just listening to your show about acetaminophen. I was very surprised that there was no discussion by the doctor about its liver toxicity. It's the number one cause of liver failure, and it's very easy to overdose. There is much info on it. This video is helpful, and he gives a Medscape link, medscape.com/view article, one word, /823341. So yes, thanks for adding that information, and I don't know why Dr. Parker didn't talk about that. Marla, via Patreon, wrote, "Thank you so much for your persistence and your patience through invaluable research. I'm inexpressibly grateful." Craig, via email, "I'm really fascinated by your paper. I hadn't heard of you until the other day. I'll definitely keep across what you're writing." Patricio, via Facebook, "Love your podcast, quote it all the time." Chris, via email, "I just listened to a May 6th podcast that you were the guest on after having read your recent papers. I want to thank you for what you've written and the work that you do. I'd also like to point out that conspiracies can be quite large and wide and going back hundreds of years, and they can also be proven with data." I actually had an interesting discussion in episode 205 with academic Curtis Hagan, who specializes in conspiracy theories. And as we talked, he pointed out that actually quite a few conspiracies come true. You can't just throw out an idea because it's a conspiracy. He also pointed out that there's no problem for the government to allege conspiracies. In fact, legally, it just takes two people making a phone call to have a conspiracy that can land people in jail for a lot more time than if it was one person individually. So I don't get too bothered by the word conspiracy theory. It's a lazy way to try to get rid of somebody who's talking about some ideas that are non-mainstream or that are opposed to government policy or whatever. Thank you for listening to episode 258 of The Infectious Myth. If you have a comment, a question, or a suggestion for a future guest, please email me at david.crow@theinfectiousmyth.com, like us at facebook.com/theinfectiousmyth, join our discussion group at facebook.com/groups/theinfectiousmyth, follow us on Twitter and Instagram at infectiousmyth, commit to monthly donations of any amount to Infectious Myth on patreon.com or librarapay.com. Until next week, thank you and goodbye.